There are some pretty enormous RTX 5080 and 5090 designs that have hit the market, and the temptation with any big GPU is to build, well, a big system. But I wondered what would happen if I took one of the largest RTX 5080 designs, this pretty stunning Palit Gamerock edition, and crammed it inside one of my favourite mini ITX chassis. Is the build going to be a nightmare to put together? Are there going to be compromises that need to be made? And crucially, is it going to affect temperatures and performance? Well, in this video, I'm going to be finding out by combining some of my favourite parts to build a small RTX 5080 gaming PC build. Let's do this. Now, of course, I'm going to begin this video by talking about the graphics card. This, the RTX 5080. Now, I should probably start by addressing the elephant in the room, the pricing on the RTX 5080 after the launch, and also my choice of this larger palette design. Now, I am not happy with how expensive 5080s were listed for at retailers, particularly here in the UK and over in the US. But as prices do start to fall, I do believe that this card will become a better value proposition. As for my choice of this palette model over the Founders Edition is virtually impossible to get your hands on, making an AIB card like this a more realistic option. And I wanted to see just how well this would fit into a smaller form factor build. The other reason is because this thing looks absolutely awesome. Now, not only do you have this really cool kind of mirrored metallic design at the front, we can do the peel. Look at that. Wow. That reflects light in a fantastic way. 3 large fans, an enormous heatsink, a backplate which is as solid as they come. You've even got chamfered metal edging to the backplate cutout. This is to allow through air from the fans out the top of the card. It is a bit of a monster. It's officially a 3-slot design, but they've only popped 2 slots on the bottom. That's to try and improve case compatibility. And of course, you get a nice RGB Gamerock logo on the top. Is this card for everybody? No, absolutely not. Do I really quite like the look of it? Yes. Now, I have done a cursory fit of our RTX 5080 inside the case I've chosen. And while I do have some concerns around getting the power cable in, I'm not going into this completely gung-ho. Now, let me talk quickly about this. This is Thermaltake's new Tower 250, and it's basically a slightly smaller version of their Tower 300. That was a smaller version of the Tower 600, which I also really like. And actually, this has a really unique layout and design that I think, if executed well, could look pretty awesome. Now, the way it works is that the motherboard is actually mounted sideways, meaning your I/O is in a slightly awkward position. However, the graphics card is going to then slot in and hang from this side of the case. If I show you how this works, you can see the card is going to slot in and hang kind of like this from the top of the chassis. It isn't too thick, it does fit. The other party trick is that down this side of the chassis, again behind more ventilation, we actually have a radiator mount that should allow us to install a 360mm all-in-one cooler. I mean, come on. As if that wasn't enough, if I spin around to the rear of the case, I believe we have room for a full-sized power supply at the back. It's currently got this smaller adapter on to allow for the installation of SFX units, but you can fit a full ATX PSU in, which may be more important than ever with 50 series given the higher power consumption, particularly on cards like the 5090. I believe this is actually the same cooler design that Palit have done on the 5090, and they are the same size. So if you wanted even more power for whatever reason, you could absolutely do that. Now, I'm not going to jump into too many technicalities and details of the 5080. You've probably already seen loads of videos, and you can check ours out in the cards now with a bit more detail. But I will be looking at detailed benchmarks, including, crucially, the temperature data. Fingers crossed, to stay tuned for that. Now, as far as the processor goes, it had to be Ryzen. I mean, Intel is in a bit of a mess right now. I've gone for the 9700X. Why? Because as much as the 9800X 3D is great, it's maybe a tiny bit overkill for the 5080, and perhaps what swayed my opinion more was how much harder it is to get hold of. Now, the 9700X is an 8-core, 16-thread CPU with decent clock speeds. You're not going to get quite the single-thread performance you'd get from the X3D lineup of CPUs, but you're still going to get great performance metrics. And of course, the AM5 platform is awesome. We've got new CPUs coming on that until at least 2027, which is great, and fantastic mini ITX motherboards like this. Now, this right here is the ASUS ROG Strix X870-i gaming Wi-Fi. and breathe. The long product name aside, and I actually love this mini ITX board from ASUS, you get a good amount of ports and expansion given, of course, the board's compact size. A lot of that comes from this sort of PCB build up here, where you've got room for Gen 5 NVMe drives, which are actually stacked on top of each other. Very clever. There are also two sort of USB-C style connectors here, and what you can do is actually pop an expansion PCB on here, which has extra connectors like your front panel cables, again, building up the size of the mini ITX board. Inside the box, you're also going to get loads of great accessories, including your ROG Strix Hive. This is sort of like your audio output DAC, and the idea behind this, I think, is to, again, take advantage of the lack of space on the motherboard by moving as much functionality off the board as possible. That expansion card I talked about earlier is in the motherboard box and looks a little something like so, and what you can see if I actually go ahead and install this onto the board is exactly how it works. You've got your front panel, you've got your SATAs, as well as a couple of extra USB 2.0 headers. Really, really clever. I just think it's fantastic to see from ASUS. What I'm going to do first is I'm going to start by installing the CPU into the motherboard. I'm also going to add RAM in at this stage. I've got 32 gigabytes of Corsair's DDR5. This is their Expo certified kit, and a Samsung 990 Pro, one of the fastest Gen 4 NVMe's right now, which is going to go into our rather large M.2 heatsink assembly. Now, before I go and install the motherboard into the case, I feel like there's an opportunity to do something quite ridiculous, and that is to install, this is so nuts, install the GPU into the motherboard, being careful. Look at that.
What the hell is even that?
Isn't that ridiculous? Have you ever seen anything so stupid in all of your life? I mean, that is absolutely amazing. I'm going to just uninstall the graphics card nice and easily from this ASUS board and install the motherboard next into the case. Before that, I'm just going to check in and see what needs to be done with our CPU cooler as far as CPU mounting hardware goes, get that remedied, and then install the board in. Nice and easy, because there's just 4 screws to contend with in the case. And we're going to save the GPU until later, because of course it makes sense to do that pretty much last. Now that the board is in, the next step is the cooler. Now, the top fans in this case by default are in exhaust on the basis that heat rises, and that kind of makes the most sense. The GPU is really going to get its own airflow, so as far as CPU cooling, we can be quite flexible. Now, I'm going to go, I think, for looks over performance to begin with. I'm going to assess what the CPU temps are like on the basis I think this is a bit overkill for our Ryzen 7 CPU, and then see where we land. These fans are really nice because they're actually magnetic, so all that happens is they just click together, and in a mini ITX build where you've not really got the space for cable management, that makes a big difference. The cooler I've gone for also has a screen on, so we can monitor those key CPU temperatures and see whether or not this configuration was smart or not after all. I'm going to begin by popping the fans onto the radiator outside of the case and getting the wire in sort of there or thereabouts, then dropping the radiator in, and finally finish off by installing the CPU water block. Remember, of course, you need a bit of thermal paste for that nice thermal bond between the CPU and the CPU cooler. I'm getting close to the GPU, but I am going to do the PSU first and be very careful with my rather large knife. No! This particular unit is actually Cybernetics Platinum certified. It's 1050 watts, which actually is probably not as overkill as it might sound for our 5080. And as you can see, crucially, just down here, it's got our brand new, I say brand new, the PCI Gen 5 power connector that power supplies have been using for a little while now, and that of course we're going to need for our Palit Gamerock 5080. I'm going to plug in all the modular cables I need, wire up the CPU power to the top left of the motherboard, but it's actually the top right. Top right of this system? Where's the CPU power? Yes, it is the top right of the system. I don't think we need any SATA power, as all the fans and ARGB in this build is going to plumb straight into the motherboard. So it's just CPU, motherboard, and GPU power before sliding the power supply into the rear. And it sits nicely at the bottom. I actually really like this design. This right here is the kind of fiddliness I'm talking about in a mini ITX build. Now, yes, arguably the case could be designed to try and make this a bit easier, but I want to get all my cables exactly in the right locations before sliding the PSU in, because if I slide this in and they're not right, my life's going to be difficult. So you can see now I've got the motherboard cable ready to go, CPU ready to go, and I've also ran the GPU around the front, and I'm hoping, if you take a look at where that is, that it's not going to impede on the actual graphics card. So we should be able to run it up the front and then in the back of the GPU. Or at least, that's the plan. And we know how plans go. All that then leaves, other than changing these fans out for some nicer RGB variants, and of course doing our front panel cables, is for the GPU to finally be installed. And boy, I'm so excited about this. First port of call is taking out these thumb screws just up here, which are, yeah, as predicted, probably too tight for me to do with my thumbs. Just get them loosened off. You'll need these in a moment when it comes to installing the GPU back into place. Slide it into the case. This is all very easy so far. Line it up with our PCI slot, and it is tight, I'm not going to lie. And then apply a bit of pressure. Look at that. That is absolutely outrageous. Couple of thumb screws to secure it down, and then my GPU power cable is going to be plugged in to our high power connector, which is just up here. And I'm not going to lie, that is one pretty insane looking system. And I like you've got a bit of room in the middle too. One thing you might be wondering is, James, does the side panel close? Now, what you do have on this panel by default is a built-in dust filter. Let's try it with the dust filter off. Obviously, that's probably less good for our GPU in terms of, wow, dust. But yeah, it fits. And you can see, probably can't quite get the fans to spin, but if I pull the panel off, spin one of these fans really quickly, that isn't touching. That fan is still spinning. Now, if I pop the dust filter on as well, which is obviously important for those of you who want to protect your new RTX 4080, there we go. Dust filter goes back on. Let's try the same test again. Line that up, get the fan spinning, boom. Now, as I say, I'm going to wrap things up with a couple of new fans at the top and by plugging in the front panel cables. And then in a moment, we're going to look at those all-important performance numbers and crucially, the temperature data to see if this thing really is hot or not. So moving through to the important question, performance. Now you can see a summary of some of the results that we gathered on your screen now, and I'll be taking a closer look into some of these titles in just a moment. I should also touch on CPU and GPU temperatures, as I know that's often contentious in small form factor builds. The GPU topped out at a maximum of 74 degrees Celsius, while the CPU was lower than this at 59 degrees C, so both very comfortably within what I would class as a good range. Look specifically at certain titles like Cyberpunk 2077 at 4K high with DLSS on, set to quality, frame gen on 4x and ray tracing set to medium, and the frame rates are unsurprisingly kind of insane, 195 FPS for example. Move through into a title that doesn't have that DLSS frame generation technology in Call of Duty's Black Ops 6 Zombies, and frame rate drops, but is still an impressive 113 FPS at 4K on average. We'll move through into a hard to run title like Hogwarts Legacy, which often presents a greater CPU based bottleneck, and frame rates are solid too, with the RTX 5080 at 4K high settings pulling in over 100 FPS. This is a really impressive small form factor build. We just need to hope the 5080 comes down in price and is a card you guys can actually buy.